to answer the entreaty from Graham at the start, which is reasons to be cheerful, and it's been hard, hasn't it, to be cheerful in this past year. But I think there's never been a better time to make big changes, to take a risk, to start a business or another initiative, to make big policy change. Because normally in our country, and I think in many countries, the most powerful force is what we did yesterday, because it tends to be what we did today and then what we'll do tomorrow, or we'll iterate. But now is an era where reform is upon us. We have to reform. We know this, we knew it already, but the crisis of COVID has accelerated many of the changes that we knew were needed already. So climate, you've already mentioned. Inequalities by gender, geography, by generation, which is really important for us to consider, all accelerate with COVID, particularly acute in our little corner of the world here in the United Kingdom. The acceleration, unfortunately, of deglobalization, which is a populist response to some of the problems that were there already, not least in inequalities between countries, but it's here, it's happening. Barriers to trade are going up. Brexit is an expression of that, but we saw it already. Changes in the United States may help, but deglobalization does appear to be the next phase after a period of excess of significant globalization. And so, you know, looking into the future, to Graham's quote from Burns, which we love, we no longer need to look into the future and guess and fear. We have to look into the future and determine what we want it to be. One of the risks just now, certainly here, but I suppose in most countries, but certainly in the UK, one of the risks is that as we come out of the crisis of COVID, that the orthodox thinking of Treasury and others means that we tighten our belts too quickly. It's really interesting that in the autumn, even the IMF, which had argued in the global financial crisis for what became known as austerity, but for public debt to be cut quickly, they are now arguing that we should keep the taps open, not just on life support, but in the recovery for what comes next. And I think that's a really important emerging thought. And it's one that we should support, because whilst of course debt adds to the burden on the next generation, and therefore can be bad for the inequality between generations, it also can be powerful if it's channeled into investment. So we need to take what is the one silver lining of the crisis, is that for most countries, and indeed for many companies, debt is historically cheap. In the United Kingdom, just for the government, in the 15 years to 2025, the overall level of national debt is projected to have risen in that period by 30%. But in the same period, the cost of servicing that debt and the debt interest will have fallen by half. So whilst there is a worry on the level, in actual fact, in historical context, given the cost, there is an opportunity here for us to be bold and not to waste that money by just spending it, but to use it for investment, not only on the life support, which is still running here in the UK and will run into the spring, hopefully won't be needed much longer than that because of what we hope from a vaccine. But what we really want to see next is investment in the transformation. Now, Willie's part of it. Susan, in your company, Scottish Water, you've identified another, which should be part of it. Why wouldn't we invest now to transform in the way that you're saying? In the private sector too, there are huge opportunities. Only yesterday, the Committee on Climate Change, which Susan referred to, launched its 6th carbon budget for the UK. Now, for us in Scotland, the Committee on Climate Change is extra potency because its chief exec, Chris Stark, is a Scot from Glasgow who was an important civil servant in the Scottish Government on energy and climate change before he took his role. But that's a really important report. If you haven't read it, read it, because what it identifies is that with a relatively small investment, roughly 1% of wealth in the UK, we can get our emissions down by 78% by 2035 compared to 1990. So that's a 15-year acceleration. Now that is, for those of us who have children who bother us every day about the inaction of the older generations on climate change, that's one of the most optimistic things I've heard in many, many months, indeed in many years. So that's big. I think the other thing to be optimistic about is whilst the world deglobalizes and the big blocs, the big countries, how to put it, assert their might, there is an opportunity for smaller countries to combine and collaborate on values. We don't need to be next to each other. We don't need to be geographically contiguous. We can collaborate on values, and there's an interesting emerging one there between New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland on the well-being economy to be noticed. And then finally, I suppose, again, a big theme for us here in Scotland is the natural economy. I noticed somebody mentioning natural capital in the chat. I'd like to get us all to think of the natural economy as basically everything that would engage sustainably the natural resources that we have at our disposal. Now, water could be seen as a huge asset for the future, as you know yourself, Susan, but Scotland has about 1/5 of the natural capital of the United Kingdom, even though we only have 8% of the population. So I'd like to see us thinking carefully about how we steward that, how we bring skills, research, and other commercial opportunities to it. So that would be my thinking. I think the biggest bedevilment of public policy making, and indeed of business growth everywhere, has been the tyranny of short-termism. Now we have in front of us the necessity to think for the long term and to transform, and it's a generation's work. Transforming ourselves takes time, and to bring the population, citizens with us, we need to be honest about that. We need to tell the truth about it, not promise jam tomorrow, promise hard work over a generation, and ultimately we can get not just this country, but hopefully many countries to a level of civilization which the population deserves. And that will also involve proper engagement with developing countries. One of the most wonderful things I read through the crisis was a piece in the Financial Times by Raghuram Rajan, who many will know as the former chief economist of the IMF and central bank governor of India, now in Chicago. And he was pointing out that if we don't support the developing world in the crisis, then the problems that they have won't stay in the developing world. They will be visited everywhere else. And I think it's so important as we focus on rebuilding ourselves that we keep a big eye on everyone else as well. And that's the final point to start with.